In this case, there was pots and pans on the top of the cooker, and you kind of think to yourself, they just haven't done their washing up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But then when you looked at the material in the frying pan, it was like, wow, that doesn't look like normal food, you know. And anyway, it turned out that, yeah, it was brain. In the mid-80s, there was a television programme called Indelible Evidence, which was fronted by Ludovic Kennedy. And essentially, I think it was like 6 or 7 programmes where they looked at cases and understood how forensic science had solved them. So I watched this programme with my mum, and I was like, I want to be a forensic scientist. So I went through school knowing that I wanted to be a forensic scientist. And that meant that my parents had to go into school and sit down with the headmaster, I guess, convincing them that I wanted to do all the sciences, so chemistry, biology, physics. And that was at the kind of at the death of everything else. All the humanities, those went out the window. I didn't do any geography. I'm rubbish at Trivial Pursuit if we need to look at history. So I can only answer questions on science, right? I did my A-levels, of course, and then I went to university. And at the time, there were no forensic science degree courses. There was only master's level forensic courses. So I had to do an undergraduate degree in biology, because I love biology. And I did that with a view that I would go on a master's in forensic science, which I did. There were 2 really in the country at the time, one in Strathclyde, which Glasgow, and the other one in London, and I did the one in Strathclyde. And the reason I did the one in Strathclyde is because they had really close relationships with forensic science laboratories all over the world. So it meant that when I was there, I could do my research, my internship effectively, with a place overseas. And that place turned out for me to be in Miami. So I travelled to Miami, did the BPA training, and again, that was just the start of the rest of my career, basically.
What are you learning on that course?
So bloodstain pattern analysis is essentially looking at the shape and the distribution and the relationship of bloodstains in an area or in an environment. So if you apply any sort of energy to blood, whether that's in the form of a violent assault or whatever it is, you have the propensity to distribute that blood in that space. So bloodstain pattern training is effectively a really cool physics lesson. Yeah, so if you think about, it's a liquid. Everybody spills liquid all the time. We knock over the coffee, we look at the pattern. But blood is kind of a little bit special because obviously when it's distributed, it's usually because somebody is catastrophically injured, in my sense anyway, because I'm largely looking at homicide. We look at the way in which the bloodstains have been distributed in order to then evaluate the mechanism by which those bloodstains were created, impact, cast off, projected blood from a damaged artery, transferred stains from people who have moved and transferred blood. And each of those categories can lead to the production of a really distinctive pattern. And if you can evaluate that pattern and interpret it, identify it, you can then say, right, this pattern is indicative of an impact spatter. And then when you know that, you can then relate that back to the activities and the alleged crime. So as an example, if somebody's been shot and injured, we can look at the pattern of bloodstains and say this is from back spatter or forward spatter, or we can understand where they were located at the moment they were shot. And it can provide this really clear narrative on positions of people, relative activities, where they were located, what they did after they were injured. I mean, the whole gamut is available. It's just how confident you can be depending on the clarity of the pattern. Some people call it a magic art. I mean, it's not. It's underpinned by really good science, but because it's so kind of subjective, because it's about observation, about what your approach to it, I think it is tarred with this brush that it's not actually a proper science. You know, I don't put a sample in one end and get a number out of the other. So it's very much, it does have a subjective aspect to it.
And when you're training and studying, like when you were in Miami, are you using real blood, or what are you using as
Yeah. I mean, there are various different proxy bloods that you can use. So as an example, on the telly, you know, they don't throw blood around. But for our purposes, we use typically animal blood, and usually horse blood or pig blood. And you kind of think, oh God, how grim, you know, I hope they didn't kill anything to create the pot of blood, which they don't. They take it under veterinary conditions. And then we essentially take the material out of it that allows blood to clot, because obviously we want to be using it in a liquid form. We do simulated assaults. So what that means is it's really important as a scientist that if you're asked to look at patterns that have been produced by different mechanisms, that you actually have done that for yourself. So we get a really big piece of pork meat, which is known to simulate human flesh. We use horse blood, we apply it to the surface of that meat, and then we bludgeon it, we kick it, we punch it, we stab it. We do all the horrible things that people do to each other in a controlled environment so that we can see the patterns that are produced as a result of those actions. So then when we see them in crime scenes, we can say, well, this is showing these observations, this is encapsulating the features that we would expect to see from an impact pattern, as an example.
As you begin your career as a crime scene investigator, what sort of crime scenes are you attending, Jo?
Yeah, so, well, because I built up a sort of specialism in bloodstain pattern analysis, and then when I moved from Edinburgh, I came down to London and I was in the homicide department. So that, by nature, is looking at scenes of suspected homicide, suspicious death. And so, to be fair, the majority of crime scenes that I've ever attended are usually sites of assault and murder. In the main, you're usually on call, so there's a 24/7 rota, and you're sat on that, and eventually you get to the top of it, and the next call that comes in, you go to that scene. So you don't know what you're going to. So once you get there, you're briefed by the crime scene manager, who gives you kind of a potted history of what they know at that moment. You put on your full crime scene kit. Everybody will know what that looks like. It's a scene suit with, you know, shoe covers. We've got a mask, we've got little hair cover or a hood, gloves, obviously. And once that's on, you go across the cordon, which is usually under police control, and into the space. Whatever somebody's told you about a space never really prepares you necessarily for what you see once you get into that space. Sometimes there can be very little blood, and it's just very nuanced, and it's just a case of just trying to work out what's happened. Or sometimes it can be a space where it's a bloodbath, and you have to try and pick it apart. And sometimes you go into a space where there is blood, but somebody's tried to conceal that in some way. So they may have tried to clean it up, they may have tried to set the room on fire, they may have, you know, changed things to try and obfuscate the investigation. So until you get in that space, you really often don't know what you're going to be having to deal with, to be fair. The thing about crime scenes is they're such a kind of an honoured space. And by that, what I mean is that if we bluster our way into it, if we go in without forethought and strategy and thinking, we're going to mess everything up. Because you have to remember that that space is the last place that somebody lived and is the place in which they died. So if you can do anything to untangle that and understand what happened, who was here, and how did we get to this point, then the only way you can do that is by respecting that space. You have to think, how can I do something that is important in my line of work without messing up the work of everybody else, because you're such a small part of that puzzle. You know, I mean, you might be called to a scene because of your specialism, but you are in no way, shape or form the big deal. You are just part of a massive team who also needs to understand that when they look at their evidence, it hasn't been compromised by somebody else because of what they were doing.
What is the first thing that you're looking for, Jo, when you get to a crime scene?
I always say that if you're going to be a bloodstain pattern scientist, the only tool you need are your eyes. I once dealt with this this scene which was absolutely horrific, actually. The guy he got really catastrophic head injuries, and the weapon was like a machete. So I mean, just think about that for a second. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. The reason why the scene had come to the attention of the police was because when there was a business had the rooms underneath this flat, and the blood was dripping through their ceiling into their office. So you can get a feel for the amount of blood that's available, and it was pretty horrendous. Weirdly enough, even though there was all this blood around, what drew my attention was like these little circular stains on the ground that moved or travelled away from this body. And I was kind of like, hang on a second, what's going on there? So when you started to follow this little trail of drops, like breadcrumbs, it led upstairs, and then when she got upstairs, there was a bedroom and bits and bobs. And on a drawer, on a unit and a drawer, there was a little blood stain on the handle. And I opened up this drawer, and in it there was another little blood drop. I was like, do you know what's happened here? Whoever's done it they've injured themselves. So all of that blood downstairs, the police and crime scene manager are like, where's she going? She's trundling off upstairs, following this trail, and we sampled this blood, and it was expedited. It was blue lighted to the laboratory for DNA analysis, which nominated an individual, and that individual is essentially the suspect in the case. And in the context of this violent assault, they'd injured themselves, and then after the killing, they'd then gone into the rest of the building to kind of look for valuables and stuff. And during the context of that search, had been dripping their own blood and deposited their blood on the things that they'd touched. The devil is in the detail, right? So, you know, all of that stuff is good in understanding what happened to this individual, but it's not really going to solve who was in this space. And that, obviously, to the police is a really important question that they need answers to. And
in that case, was the person who committed the crime caught based on your...
Yeah. I mean, it was really tragic because they collected a few bits of, a few valuables, bit of jewellery, a little bit of cash, and they left that scene. They walked down the street a few doors down. I think it was a fish and chip shop or something like that. And there was a slot machine, and they put the money in the slot machine and they lost it all. And you kind of think, what an absolute waste. They've just gone through that horrendous killing just for the sake of a few quid, and then they've put it all in a slot machine and it's gone.
What's the most shocking crime that you've come across in your work, Jo?
Yeah, the brain one. Oh. So I went to the scene, it was in East London actually, with a really esteemed colleague, and the suspect ultimately, he was a really troubled individual. He was very seriously mentally ill actually, but he was on a day release from his facility, and he befriended this chap, and he went back to his flat, and he ended up killing him. And then in the aftermath of that, he dismembered his body, and then he took his brain and he cooked it up in a frying pan. And, I mean, what can you say about that? I mean, that's just absolutely catastrophic. You can't judge anything. You can't think, how on earth do people live in a space like this? You have to just think, people live in a space like this. How can I cut through that and get to the evidence? And in this case, there was pots and pans on the top of the cooker, and you kind of think to yourself, they just haven't done their washing up. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But then when you looked at the material in the frying pan, it was like, wow, that doesn't look like normal food, you know. And anyway, it turned out that, yeah, it was brain.
I read about a case where you found just a body in a freezer. Can you tell me a bit about that, Jo?
Yeah, the steps that people go to cover their tracks is pretty extensive, actually. But this case in particular, the school, I think, had rung the grandparents and said, are you going to collect these kids? Because the mum hadn't gone to school to collect the children. And when when the family went back to their house, it was empty. The only thing that was left in this place was the piano, a couple of dumbbells, and a chest freezer in the kitchen. And when they looked in this chest freezer, the body of the mum had been chopped up and put in bags in this freezer, and the rest of the belongings were gone. When you walked in, I remember thinking, where's the blood? Why am I here? Yeah, because there was literally nothing visible to the naked eye. And so we applied a chemical to enhance blood staining. And what it did was it started to sort of pick up traces of blood which were indicative of a clean-up. So there had been blood there. She had been dismembered in that space, but there'd been sufficient clean-up that none of that was really obvious anymore. But it was only when we enhanced it with chemicals that we could see the traces that were left. Again, the thing is that we've got technology available to us that can detect blood that isn't visible to the naked eye. Everybody's familiar with luminol. That's a chemical that we spray in darkened conditions, and it causes blood to luminesce. So it kind of glows with this blue glow. So we can use that really effectively. And the thing about cleaning is we're not very good at it, especially from a blood point of view. You know, if I was going to chop up something, I'd do it in the bath. Yeah, because then I can get the head of the shower and I can hose it down and clean as a whistle. Or so you think. Because the thing is, between the tiles of the bathroom, there's grout that soaks up blood like a sponge. The blood is pushed into the nooks and crannies of the bathroom. It can seep into the tiles of the floor. And so all of the spaces that you clean are they look clean, but they're not clean forensically. And when you start to pull the bath panel away, there's blood staining behind there. So it's very difficult to clean up. And unless you're in a kind of a space that is completely disinfectable, then you're going to leave some trace, especially traces that luminol can detect.
What mistakes do murderers make?
You know, we've got technology up the wazoo, you know, to detect crime, to understand what people have done, to detect trace amounts of evidence. They go to quite extreme efforts sometimes to get rid of the evidence. But in every single case, certainly in my experience, I mean, every contact leaves a trace, right? So it's impossible, frankly, to eradicate every single jot of evidence in a crime scene. So the mistakes that they make, apart from not really fully understanding the potential of forensic science, is they forget that they're leaving traces of themselves on every surface that they touch, on every path that they take. You know, we've known about fingerprints for centuries, and yet it's probably one of the main ways in which people are identified. So you kind of think to yourself, how did you forget that you leave fingerprints? I once dealt with a case where the perpetrator had taken the blood of his victim and he'd written a really horrible word on the wall and then done an exclamation point. And in that point was his fingerprint in the blood of the victim. And you kind of think to yourself, what an idiot. You know, I mean, seriously, did you not think that was going to lead to, your detection. Don't underestimate forensic science is the take-home message.
And you worked on the London bombings case. Can you tell me a bit about that?
The London bombings happened and I was at the top of the list. But obviously it was all hands on deck for that incident. But the thing that I was involved with was the examination of the car that the bombers had used to travel down from, I can't remember where, but to Luton Airport, and it had been subjected to a controlled explosion to ensure it was safe. That car was then transported to London Laboratory, where I examined it in a really secure environment, basically. It was a Micra, little tiny Micra. And whatever they'd done to it, the central locking had bust. So I couldn't open any of the doors to get in like a normal person. I had to sort of lean in through the windows, which were smashed. So I got a bit of kind of like, well, it's like filter paper. I kind of folded that up and put it over this broken glass so that I could lean in and try and swab stuff, because what we were trying to establish was who's driven it, yeah? So, you know, you naturally swab the steering wheel and the gear lever and the handbrake and the bits and the bobs that people touch when they're driving. There was quite a bit of hair debris in the car, which was there. But when I went into the driver's side and looked down into the pocket of the door, there was a little peanut packet. You know, when you buy a bag of peanuts, it's got that little cut so that you can tear the packet, yeah? Well, that was torn and it was empty. And when I looked at the little tear, it looked a bit gnawed, a little bit teethy mark, something like that. And I thought to myself, you know what, if I was driving this car and I got myself a packet of peanuts, how might I open it? I might tear it open with my teeth. We examined this peanut packet and we swabbed around this little tear, and it generated a DNA profile that identified one of the bombers, because he'd literally just eaten a packet of peanuts. I didn't lead that investigation, but the team that they spent 24/7 in the laboratory. We were having pizza deliveries into the lab because the volume of work that was required in response to that event was just unbelievable. We were working a shift system. They were examining item after item after item. And, you know, there's a massive responsibility because obviously it was a horrendous incident, but you want to repatriate every single piece of body tissue in a situation like that back to the person so that that person can then, you know, have the correct burial or whatever it might be. So you're asking people to pick bits of body tissue off buildings, out of buses. You're asking them to work in spaces that are just, you know, beyond imagination. So me leaning in to a little Micra on a piece of filter paper was frankly the least of our worries, to be honest.
And how do you protect like your you know, mental health when you're dealing with such graphic and kind of awful crimes? Like, how do you take that step away from work?
I feel that I've got quite a grounding. I feel that I respect myself. So I hope that I respect the job enough to know that it can have a really significant impact on well-being and mental health. You volunteer to go into these scenes. It's part of your job, it's part of your training, but I think it would be naive to think that, you know, that they don't have an impact on you. And also that, you know, I think if you ever normalise that experience, you're in big trouble, because, you know, these spaces are challenging. They're, you know, they're places that no one should ever really have to operate. But once you get into there, you just have to put on a different hat and get on with it. Any scenario which is not normal has to imprint on your brain. And I think with a nudge, in most cases, I would almost transport myself back into pretty much every crime scene I've ever attended. I adore it. I mean, I can't even tell you. I mean, I've never worked a day in my life. I know that's such a cliche. If you think about Blackpool Rock and you chop it down the middle, it says Blackpool. I would hope that when they chop me down the middle, I'm going to say forensic science. I honestly I can't see a life, I can't see any other life for me. I've always wanted to be forensics, and I've always wanted to be where I am today, and to be there is just mind-blowing, really.
And you have to use language very carefully. You have to time your kind of inquiries and questions in a really thoughtful way. It's a bit like kind of doing surgery on the mind, in a way.